Hi guys, today we're talking about a Nikon FE. Nikon FMs and FEs came out in 1977, 1978. The FE was one year behind the FM. These two cameras replaced the Nicormat line in the Nikon series. So Nikon was selling Nikon Fs to the professionals and Nicormats to the amateurs and enthusiasts at a significantly reduced price for the Nicormats. As Nikon F2s and the ongoing series of Nikons came out, then they produced the FM and the FE to replace the Nicormat line. These models lasted for many years. In fact, the chassis, the basic chassis, was the same size and shape and the same metal used for many versions of these cameras from 1977 to 2006. 29 years this lasted. This particular FE comes with a 50mm f2 lens. My brother-in-law gave it to me, so it's a grateful present, which I really appreciate. This particular one is non-functional. If it was functional, its value on eBay would be anywhere from $60 to $125 in working condition, and people who have them love them. When this camera was new, it cost $330 in 1978. Originally, when the FE was introduced, and most enthusiasts preferred the FM because they were scared of the electronics. They thought it wouldn't be reliable, and they didn't want to get caught with a camera that didn't work if their battery was dead. For probably 20 or 30 years, they were perfectly reliable, and many of them swear by these cameras. Now that it's been 40 plus years since this camera was introduced, most of the FEs are starting to fail. So if you do buy one, make sure it works. The biggest problem, of course, is corrosion, and the electronics fails inside. Corrosion can be caused by a lot of things. The obvious one is when the battery goes bad. You see the corrosion around batteries where you see all that white dust. But when that happens, depending on the chemistry of the battery, gases also get released into the camera, even on good batteries. And eventually with batteries in cameras, there's internal corrosion and anything can happen. In this case, this camera had a dead short. So when I put batteries in it, they would quickly get very hot. And so I measured underneath, I took the battery out and measured in the battery compartment, and sure enough, there's a dead short between the plus and minus terminals of the battery. I took it apart and tried to fix it. I'll show you some pictures of that. But basically, I couldn't find where the problem was, and it became obvious pretty soon that it was beyond my capabilities to fix it. And again, even if I could fix it, I'll never take pictures with it. I'll just put it on the wall. It's a beautiful camera, so let me show you some of the features of the Nikon FEs. When it was made, its advantages were it had a center-weighted 60-40 exposure meter, aperture priority mode with exposure compensation. It has an exposure lock, and it has a titanium bladed vertical travel focal plane shutter with speeds from 1 second to 1,000th of a second, plus X-Sync up to 125th. That put it on par with all of its competitors. This particular model, the FEs, use a matched needle system for the exposure metering, and you see it through the viewfinder. There's two needles, a green needle and a black needle. In manual mode, the green needle represents the shutter speed, and as you turn the shutter back and forth, the needle will move and it'll indicate the shutter speeds. And the black needle indicates the meter reading, and you move the black needle to make it superimpose it over the green needle, matching the needles. And then if you look in the top of the viewfinder, you can see optically the aperture setting that you've selected. So you can match the needles and change them back and forth. In automatic mode, when you put the shutter speed in auto, then the green needle goes completely to the top of the screen to show that you're in automatic mode. And now the black needle changes roles, and it indicates the shutter speed that's being selected automatically to correspond with whatever you set the aperture ring at. It sounds complicated, but when you actually look through the viewfinder and do it, it's intuitively obvious and easy to use. So let's take a look at the camera front. There's a lot of interesting features on this. It looks pretty plain, but it gets interesting real fast. This is a self timer. I'm not going to advance it because sometimes on cameras when you do that, you'll wish you never did. They'll jam up. But you can push it this way, and that's what Nikon calls the memory lock, shutter speed memory lock. And so that's the equivalent of a new electronic camera where you would half depress the shutter button so that you could lock in focus and exposure. On this camera, you would lock in exposure, at least the shutter speed, by pushing it in. So this assumes you're in auto mode. It's selecting the shutter. You've got it where you want it. You push this in so you could then recompose and shoot. So you might want to put it down at someone's dark clothes, lock the shutter, then raise it back up and take a picture of their face or something like that. You do have to hold it in though. It doesn't snap in or stay in. So it gets a little awkward, but it's quite usable. On this side, this is the flash sync port for X-Sync electronic flash. This, of course, is the release button to take the lens off. One of the big features that Nikon was made sure to advertise on the FMs and FEs were that they were completely compatible with all of the auto-indexing lenses and all of the non-auto-indexing lenses, the older ones. And they call them AI lenses, auto-index. And the way they did that is kind of interesting. So let me get this off and show you. Like all Nikons, the lens gets removed in the clockwise direction, the opposite of the rest of the world. So this little lever here, and I'll show you a close-up picture of it, and this little button, together, they form the option for the non-auto-indexed lenses. So normally you leave it alone like this. If you bought the camera with a new lens, it would have come with an auto-indexing lens and you don't need to ever touch this. But if you have older lenses that were non-auto-indexing and you wanted to use them, you'd push this little button down, this release button, and then flip this lever out like that. And that lever sticking out would get out of the way then so that non-indexing lenses could work properly. Now let me put it back because they do claim on some websites that if you put this in the wrong position, you can actually harm a lens. So I'm not going to fiddle with it much. But let me show you how the lens understands this mess. So here's an auto-indexing lens. And there are two ways that you can tell what an auto-indexing lens is. And then there's one way that's actually just confusing to people. So this prong is used for non-auto-indexing lenses, and they left it on these so that these could be used with older cameras in a non-auto-indexing way, which is kind of interesting. But then as the years went on and Nikon realized that they no longer have to support the really, really old cameras anymore, they just physically removed this prong, and there were still two little holes in the lenses where you could see where the prong used to be on some of the newer lenses. So ignore that prong. As you can see, when you put it on here, that prong set to your aperture doesn't touch anything. It's not used in this model. Now, there are two ways you can tell by looking at this lens that it's a auto-indexing lenses, and they're both a little subtle. Right here next to the aperture indicator numbers, there's a little ledge of plastic. Well, actually it's not plastic, it's steel, but it's painted black and it looks like plastic. This edge, this little tab, is the secret to indexing. And I'll show you, and you can tell by when you put the lens on, it hits this little lever and pushes this ring over like that. You could do this from the other side so you can see it. And what that is when the lens gets attached and this gets pushed over, the amount that it gets pushed over communicates to the camera what the maximum f-stop of this lens is. In this case, this is an f2 lens. It doesn't push it very far. So when you put this in, it's this edge of the plastic that engages with that little lever, and it pushes it that far. And now it knows that there's an f2 lens attached. The other way that you can tell by looking at a lens that it's an auto-indexing lens is the aperture setting dial indicators. So when you see the numbers here from F2 to F16, there's another set of little bitty numbers from F2 to F16. And the reason for those little bitty numbers is so that they can be seen through this little window at the top of the pentaprism head, so that light shines on that, goes through there, and you can actually look through the viewfinder and read the f-stop. The other thing that's interesting on these Nikon FEs is that the focusing screen is interchangeable. So I'll zoom in with a close-up on this so you can see it, but there's a little tab right here at the top of the focusing screen, and you can push it down and then pull out the old focusing screen and replace it with a new one. If you buy a new focusing screen, there were like 4 or 5 different ones made for this camera. They come with a little tool for helping you to slide that in and out. So I'll put this back together. Now let's look at the top of the camera. This is the exposure compensation ring. And if you lift it to turn it, and then this little indicator here, which is set at 0, can be set at half stops for half a stop overexposed, 1 stop, 1.5, 2. That would be 2 stops overexposed. Or you can go in the opposite direction and go 2 stops underexposed. And I'll put it back to the middle. So if you were out in the winter taking pictures in snow, you would want to compensate for that with the exposure reading. Or if you're inside a coal mine at night, you'd do the opposite. The ASA setting over here is the indicator, and you would turn this lever, but you have to hold the button down to do it. So you push the button down, and then you can rotate it. So right now I'll set it at ASA 400 and lock it in. This little lever is a safety lock so that you don't accidentally open the back of the camera. So on most cameras, or on a lot of cameras, you open the backs by raising up the film rewind knob. So if you pulled on this, you would be able to pop open the back of the camera. In this case, it's locked, and you have to release this lever first, push it back, and then you can pull this up. And then you pull hard, and it pops open, and you can open the back. So in the back, here's your metal, titanium, vertical, focal plane shutter. And you can see it winding the titanium slowly. So it's not a cloth shutter like the older ones. I'll snap that back, and we're back to normal. This is the hot shoe. The hot shoe is interesting because if you had a Nikon flash, it communicates with the camera to tell you when it's ready. So there's an extra light in the viewfinder. At the very top of the viewfinder, there's a little LED that would light up when the flash is completely recharged and ready for another shot. Here's where you set the shutter speeds. If you turn it to auto, like I just did, then it locks in and it won't move. And you can't move it, so you have to push the little button down to get it out of auto mode. If you any other mode, you can freely turn it back and forth, which would be very handy for when you're actually looking through the viewfinder trying to set the shutter speed to match the needles. The M90 setting is if your battery is dead, you can take photos at a 90th of a second. And then of course there's B for the bulb setting. The X sync is in red for 125th of a second to help remind you that that's the fastest shutter speed that'll work with an electronic flash. This is the shutter release button, which is standard threads for cable release. This is the film advance and shutter cocking winder. And You see that red dot. When you close this, it turns the battery off, and when you open it, the battery is turned on. Also, when it's open and the shutter is advanced, you could take pictures, but if the shutter is advanced and it's closed, you can't take a picture. It's locking the shutter release as well as turning the battery off. So it does two functions. And this little lever, which is a little hard to see, is for taking double exposures. So if you took a picture here and you wanted to take another one without advancing the film, you just pull back on this little lever and advance it at the same time. And when you do it, you can feel that the film did not advance. You can take multiple pictures like that. You only have to hold it for a split second, not through the entire cycle, because it starts to get in your way right away with the lever. And if you don't do it, you can hear the film advance. And then that's the film frame counter window right there. On the camera back, we have the memo holder for your reminding you which kind of film you have in. There's a battery check lever. You push it that way to test the battery. So you would push it down and it would light up. In my case, it never lights up because the battery is shorted, so I can't show you that. The viewfinder is a wonderful viewfinder. The split image focusing ring is wonderful on this focusing screen. I don't think there's ever been a better one made. And the viewfinder ring can be removed, and you can attach corrective lenses for your prescription glasses. The camera bottom gets interesting. It's obvious right away that this camera is made to take a motor drive. So here are the contacts for the motor drive assembly. There's the battery compartment. It takes two LR44 batteries, a standard 1/4 20 thread tripod socket. This little button is the film release for rewinding it. You have to hold that in while you crank the film in. That's the mechanical connection for the motor drive. The motor drive is an MD11, takes up to 3.5 frames per second. When I say up to, because obviously if you took longer exposures, like 1 second exposures, you can't go any faster than the shutter can release. This little pin has two functions. It's an alignment pin for the motor drive, but it's also an electrical contact. So it does two things. It's kind of interesting. So that's it for the Nikon FE. Pretty little camera. Has a big piece in history. When the FEs came out, Nikon mats were no longer used, and this was what enthusiasts and amateurs like to use for the next 20 or 30 years. Thanks everyone for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe and tell your friends about this YouTube channel. And here's a shameless plug for my book. It's available on all of the normal ebook sellers and also hard copies on lulu.com. As always, I really appreciate all you guys coming to watch these videos. Thank you. Bye.